Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Thomas. I am here on behalf of SAC-DC. I serve as the president of that organization. SAC-DC is a business chamber of commerce. We're delighted today to be partnering with our friends at Foley and Lardner to discuss supply chain management issues, a subject that is of great interest to me as a 35-year person in the medical device industry. I know exactly how complicated and important it is. And so I will be paying attention with all of you, but I'm not presenting, so I will turn it over to our colleagues at Foley and Lardner and look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you so much for having us. My name is Vanessa Miller. I'm an attorney at Foley. I'm based out of our Detroit office, and I do a lot of supply chain commercial counseling, contracting, as well as if something escalates to a supply chain dispute, I'm a litigator. Joining me today is my colleague, Greg Husisian, in our Washington, D.C. office. He's going to be talking about the regulatory side of things. But to kick off, next slide, please. To kick off, we're going to talk, we'll share the CLE information. And if you are seeking CLE credit today, please go ahead and send, Elizabeth's going to read the code.
Hi, everyone. Before we start today's presentation, the CLE, for attendees seeking CLE credit, you're required to complete the attorney affirmation form in addition to answering polling questions. Please email your completed form to my email, which is on the screen, epensac@foley.com. CLE certificates of attendance will be distributed to eligible participants approximately 8 weeks after the webinar. Additionally, I will connect with everyone following the program to confirm next steps. Please record the following CLE code so you can enter it on your form. The code is V as in Victor, T as in Tom, 3, H as in Henry, 9. Again, that is V, Victor, T, Tom, 3, H as in Henry, 9. I will turn it back over to Vanessa and our presenters for the following presentation.
Thank you. So we've all seen global supply chains in various states of chaos or manufacturers scrambling to play catch up over the last 3.5 years. And I think many agree that the volatility in supply chains is here to stay. They've become increasingly complex and global. And if you could just mute the lines and hear a little bit of background noise. Thank you. So many industries embrace lean manufacturing, rely on sole sourcing in specially designed products or components, and operate on what's referred to as a just-in-time basis, meaning that parts are consumed within days or minutes of being received at the plant, which really leaves no room for delays, shortfalls, or other issues. We have many clients ask us whether we think the supply chain issues are going to improve. And I think that although manufacturers did handle the issues and obstacles they were facing quite well during COVID and then the ensuing inflationary issues that we're still suffering, we will continue to face obstacles in the near future across our supply chains. I would like to highlight 6 key obstacles and what you should be doing or thinking about now with respect to those obstacles. Next slide. So the number one pain point that I hear about right now are labor shortages. Last fall in Detroit, we weathered the months-long UAW strike, which is going to continue to have rippling impacts for the big 3 automakers in the US. Labor and much of manufacturing, it's not just factory workers that are just putting a cog into a machine. Much of it is quite skilled labor and it's talent. In the US, in June of last year, there were 600,000 manufacturing jobs that were unfilled. And I'm waiting for the report to come out this year, but I expect that it's going to continue to be grim. Analysts are thinking that this number will continue to grow across the globe for a variety of reasons. We're living through the great resignation, the great attrition. It's not exactly behind us, where jobs are not being filled after employees resign or retire. And manufacturers are going to need to continue offering wage increases in order to attract talent and workforce. Many clients tell me they can't compete with the hourly wages being offered across the street from their production facilities by the fast food restaurants who are offering better hours, free food, and tuition reimbursement. So there's certain generational realities as well that the workforce is going to have to grapple with in the developed countries where most manufacturing occurs. Next slide. This chart shows the generational makeup of the US labor workforce in 2030, so 6 years from now. Not surprisingly, it's going to be predominantly comprised of millennials and Gen Z, which is consistent with worldwide trends in other countries. Next slide. So China, Japan, and Europe overall are expected to have the largest landslides in their populations. There's something called a replacement fertility rate. That refers to the ratio of children per woman in order to keep the population even. The rate is not an even 2, it's actually higher, slightly higher. It's 2.1 is the replacement fertility rate. But this predicts that by the year 2100, we'll be at 1.9, so significantly worse than flat. And then I was just reading an article over the weekend saying that over the last 5-6 years, the rate hasn't even been keeping up with the expectation of a downturn, and it's looking like it's actually going to be lower. Next slide. By 2100, 5 of the world's largest countries are projected to be in Africa. But as we know, there's currently very little manufacturing in Africa, little infrastructure, and geopolitical incentives exist or lack, there's a lack thereof, to make these regions hospitable places to attract manufacturers. So manufacturers are going to continue to navigate serious labor availability and shortages across all levels of talent to sustain operations. Next slide. Obstacle number 2, software. Embedded software is absolutely the new normal. Software is being utilized across all components of vehicles, consumer appliances, and other assemblies. It's integrated in many assemblies that it was not before. And contracts really have not caught up to this reality. Considering things like who owns the software embedded in a manufacturing assembly, the life cycle of products. What is the life cycle of a software product where you have software, by the time you launch the product, sometimes the software is already almost obsolete because it's developing and there's state-of-the-art improvements being made so quickly. Who is responsible for updating the software and over-the-air updates when they can be done remotely? And then does this create almost a perpetual warranty with respect to the ability to do over-the-air updates? What does that mean to the consumers, the buyers, and the suppliers? And then thinking about what this could mean in terms of recalls. Being in the automotive industry, many issues rise to the level of safety issues that involve software nowadays. And that could make vehicles ripe for recalls if the software has not evolved as quickly, even though the vehicle may be several years old. Next slide. So this chart shows the growth rate of embedded software, and you can see that the dark blue and green are automotive and healthcare, which are leading the pack, but all industries, all 6 industries listed here are trending upwards. Next slide. Obstacle number 3, connectivity. The expectation of instantaneous information across all devices. I want you to think about how many of your devices in your home or in your office are connected now versus what we were used to 10 years ago. And think about where we'll be 10 years from now. Consumers really do expect information at their fingertips, and they're going to be looking for connectivity across more and more products. And when you have connections, you of course are generating data. So what data can be collected? Who owns the data? And how can you use it? Next slide. And this is just a picture of, I call it the Jetsons kitchen because it reminds me of a cartoon I watched as a kid. And now this is the reality. We have all of these things that you can do from an app on your phone in your kitchen. Even cameras inside of the fridge to tell you what you're out of, so that you can, well, you don't even need to order it from the grocery store. You don't even need to go to the grocery store to get it. You can now go online and get it delivered to your house on an app. So it's really fascinating. Next slide. And then of course, the connected car is somewhere where we're seeing cars are more likely, are more computers than cars nowadays. And this just shows some of the areas where the vehicle features connectivity and there's data being generated. One of my clients is a tire manufacturer, and they even have sensors in the tires to track wear and tear on tires, road conditions, flats. So it's throughout the entire vehicle. Next slide. And this is the norm, but again, contracts are lagging. Considering who is design responsible to ensure connectivity in complex assemblies with integrated parts. What about hacking and cybersecurity issues and risks? Who's taking those on? And then how will any liability be allocated between the two parties or multiple parties that are involved? And finally, the data concerns and regulations that we expect to see, and how manufacturers are going to need to navigate those. Next slide. Okay, obstacle number 4 is AI. Now, this is an obstacle, but it's also, of course, an opportunity. Many of these are. AI is a very good solution for some of the labor pain points. We are seeing manufacturers that invested heavily in robotics, cobots, and other AI systems are faring better across some of these labor pain points. And that's becoming the norm in many manufacturing facilities. But as with any new technology, there'll be regulations that will follow, and every industry is facing this, not just manufacturers in general. I mean, look, even legal is facing this, and we're talking about AI and what you can do with it and what you should do with it. But then what if there's an issue, who's responsible? Next slide. So companies are not considering all AI impacts. Thinking about these engineering groups that work together to develop new products between the buyer and the seller, who owns that? If you're relying on AI and a generative system to generate that, is that new IP? Which party owns it? Data privacy considerations. If you're feeding personal data into AI or proprietary company data into AI, that exists somewhere then. If that's not a contained AI system within your company, that exists out in the universe if you're feeding that into a different system. And that can have serious concerns for companies that have proprietary information and trade secrets. So there's a lot of power in AI with the potential to really transform every industry, increase efficiencies, quality, decrease costs, but we're going to need human supervision and intervention to make sure that it's managed properly. Next slide. Climate change. We've already seen major force majeure events impacting manufacturers, and it seems to get more and more severe as the years go by. Pictured here, I have the stranded freight containers and flooded roads due to severe rainstorms. But as we see these increasingly severe weather events, heat wave storms, et cetera, that are occurring across the globe, there's going to continue to be, and there always have been, major and unpredictable impacts to manufacturing supply chains. And then what about power outages? With everything electrified and connected, power is going to be critical. We talk about this concern all of the time when we're talking about the EV frontier and automobiles, because how are you going to charge them if there's a major power outage or a brownout? Next slide. So looking ahead, and I have here an image of regular cold chain transport that you would see for pharmaceutical items or medicines, or you would see for food. But looking ahead, as assemblies contain more and more connections and electronics, they're going to be more sensitive to heat. And these assemblies and components that currently spend weeks or even months in transit by truck, rail, ocean freight, we're going to need to have solutions for whether we expand the cold chain transport beyond food and pharmaceuticals, or we otherwise expedite components time in transit if they're heat sensitive. Next slide. Finally, geopolitical concerns. They've always existed and will continue to have serious geopolitical impacts given global supply chains and companies' longer term strategies to decide where they're sourcing something from and where they're manufacturing products in, and what countries and regions they want to be investing in versus trying to avoid. Next slide. Okay, so now looking at some of the positives, what can we be doing to mitigate some of these risks and thinking about now that are longer term strategy considerations? Next slide. These are not rules, and they're not going to apply to every single company, and they're not one size fits all. It's going to be very individualized based on your company's goals, your products, as well as what your supply chain looks like. But these are at least suggestions that can be customized. Next slide. Okay, so suggestion number 1 is strengthening and diversifying labor and talent. Next slide. So manufacturing, I cannot stress enough how much it involves skilled labor, not just from the engineers, but from the folks on the floor assembling products. There's significant training that is involved and institutional knowledge that occurs when you have a factory worker that has been with the company. Anyone that gets to walk the floor of a factory, which is one of my favorite things to do, it's just fascinating to see how much know-how and talent is involved in putting products together. So the goal of attracting and retaining talent is something that companies are looking at across all of their employees right now. There's so many studies coming out about how you can't expect millennials and Gen Z to stay at the same job. So what are we going to do to change that or stem some of that loss of knowledge and loss of know-how? And looking at things like long-term employee incentive and retention plans, cross-training plant workers, because that will not just have increased functionality and flexibility in the event that you have someone from one of your assembly lines that needs to take a sick leave, is on parental leave, or leaves the company. But also there's studies showing that it increases job satisfaction and makes the employee more versatile and feel more valued and want to stay longer at the company. Of course, investing in AI, where to do it and why you need to do it now, and looking at the right solutions for your manufacturing lines. And then contracting with your supply base or your customer, whether you're the buyer or the seller, thinking about how are we going to can we share pain points for labor issues? Or is this something that I expect my long-term strategic supplier to take on their own, even if the labor rates significantly increase and it becomes unprofitable? Next slide. Suggestion number 2 is to engage in supply chain mapping and really identify past issues, even looking before COVID, because we always had supply chain issues, stop ship threats, force majeure events, and thinking through that. Next slide. So I said this is the where, the who, the what, the where, the how far away in your supply chain. Thinking about, are there repeat problems here that we keep seeing? Is one supplier demanding a price increase year over year on a fixed price contract, and every year we're renegotiating it? Maybe we need to look at moving away from that supplier. Is there geopolitical concerns that we should be thinking about for certain reasons? So looking beyond just the one tier below, everyone knows where they're getting all of their components and raw materials from that go directly into their part. But thinking about tiers below that is so important, because what we saw all across the automotive industry with respect to the semiconductor crisis was perhaps you would have 2 suppliers for certain components or assemblies, but then both of those suppliers triangulated back to the same semiconductor supplier, the same chip supplier. And when there was the shortage and you could not obtain those components, it didn't matter that you had diversified one tier below you. Next slide. Revisiting your terms and conditions and really having two sets of terms and conditions. You should have terms and conditions of sale when you're the seller, and then terms and conditions of purchase when you're the buyer. And there should be different considerations because there's certainly different leverage points on both sides. And I say, and rewrite the force majeure provision, plural. Next slide. And why this is so important is we all saw everyone rushing to their contracts and looking at their force majeure provisions, which before COVID were really just a cut and paste, an afterthought in the contract. They were always in the miscellaneous section with not a lot of thought or tailoring given, whether you're on the buy side, the sell side, buying a long-term fixed price contract, or just buying one piece of equipment that needed to be specially designed. Not much thought was given. I always have had this on my top 5 contract provision clauses training that I do for clients, because force majeure is something that is so critically important when you need to rely on that provision. And because it's a creature of contract, you have to have it in your contract to have the defense of force majeure. It certainly typically tends to benefit the seller because that's the party that's tasked with delivering the product. And force majeure means something bad happened that was listed in the party's contract that we discussed and contemplated could happen through neither fault of either one of us. And now I can't get you the product. And I call it it's a timeout under the contract, that until the seller can get back up and running and supplying the product to you, they're not in breach, and that you're allowed to then go out into the marketplace and get that product from somebody else while they come back online. Now, there's a whole bunch of other considerations that should be taken into account with respect to force majeure on the buy side and the sell side. And I'll have some clients that come to me and say, well, I'm the buyer and I don't want a force majeure provision. And I really caution buyers to think carefully and critically about that. Without a force majeure provision, meaning you haven't negotiated it in your contract as to what the bad things are that could happen that might take your seller offline. Without it, you do revert to the doctrine of commercial impracticability, which arises for the sale of all goods in the United States under the UCC section 2-615. And the doctrine of commercial impracticability says something bad happened that the parties didn't contemplate, and therefore you're excused from performance. Well, that's broader than most force majeure provisions, which will list out specific events and then talk about how long the seller gets to come back online. 30, 60, 90 days. If you can't come back online, it gives the buyer the right to terminate. So thinking about these things with respect to your critical suppliers and your critical customers, and negotiating what the right resolution is. And I think there is a tug of war on both sides. Some of the things a buyer might want in the force majeure provision, a seller might want it to be broader, buyer want it to be narrower, buyer probably wants to exclude things like labor strikes, and you want to shorten the time to resume performance. We'll often also have clients point out to me, well, I don't need to worry about having an out in my contract because I have the right to terminate for convenience under my contract. And even if you have that right, if you have a situation where your critical supplier is not able to get back online in the time you need, you certainly want to be able to go out into the marketplace and negotiate high volume sales with a new supplier, a replacement supplier, not just rely on spot buys, which you're probably paying a lot more for at a premium. And you want to have the right to terminate under the force majeure provision itself, because you don't want to have to pay for things like obsolescence and material on the water if you're completely needing to switch a supplier because they can't come back up within a certain amount of time. Next slide. Suggestion number 4 is just a little bit broader than looking at your T's and C's and force majeure provisions, but consider risks and fluctuations that you can allocate by contract and what your leverage points are We've seen so many pricing disputes over the last few years because of unanticipated impacts and inflationary pressures. These are things that many did not think about when they might have entered into a long-term fixed price agreement, but now all the assumptions that manufacturer made in quoting that price back maybe 5-10 years ago are completely no longer valid. And all the prices have gone up across the board, from raw materials to labor to freight. And the company's losing money on that. So thinking about going forward, can we look at indexing or some kind of price shifting provisions for things like raw materials, labor, freight? Can we have volume targets in place? Because we see this all the time in automotive, the volumes fluctuate massively. And of course, if you're anticipating very high volumes, you may be able to amortize your investments across those high volumes. But if you don't achieve those volumes, if a program is terminated early, or it's just much lower than what was anticipated, but you're still holding capacity for that customer, you're not going to realize a return on your investments. And that's starting to be something that I think companies are paying more attention to, is that volumes must be realized in order for me to be profitable. Next slide. And I just covered this one. Next slide. Suggestion number 5 would be considering fundamental changes to the just-in-time lean manufacturing model with a sole source supplier, if you have that model for some or all of your components. Next slide. So I understand that it's not possible across all components and all raw materials and operations, that sometimes you will need to rely on the lean manufacturing model, sole source, because it's a specially qualified component, or you can only get the material from one supplier. But there are certainly things that can be dual sourced and should be. You can look at dual sourcing from different locations. You can look at warehousing or stockpiling some quantity of components. I mean, we saw this in automotive. They were hit the hardest by the semiconductor shortage. There are tons of semiconductors in healthcare products, and healthcare was not impacted as severely as automotive. The reason for that is that healthcare had warehouses and safety stock of the semiconductors, which makes sense. They're very tiny little chips that go into so much. They're critical, and they don't really go bad that quickly sitting on the shelf. So there are some things that you can do to build in a buffer in the event of a supply chain issue. Of course, that's going to cost a little bit more, but when lines were being shut down left and right in automotive, I think the small investment it would have been to have stockpiled some of these things or warehoused them would have been recovered quite quickly versus assembly lines going down. Next slide. And then the final suggestion is considering fundamental changes to the length and distance of the supply chain. Because of course, as your supply chain gets longer and further away from you, you have less control over it. Next slide. So I know that that's a long-term strategic decision, but many companies are looking at nearshoring, reshoring, moving away from certain countries, regionalizing certain assemblies. And it's definitely something that requires buy-in from across the entire company. But when you have things closer to you, you have more control over them. All right, I'm going to hold questions until after Greg has had an opportunity to present, but please, we would really appreciate questions at the end. This on the screen right now is a link to a handbook that I recently published, The Law of the Automotive and Manufacturing Supply Chain. And it's supposed to be an executive handbook that is intended for a non-lawyer to talk about what you should be thinking about with respect to your commercial contracts and your supply chain, and why those things are important. So please feel free to scan the QR code here and request a copy if you're interested. All right, Greg, over to you.
Okay. So recently, my wife sent me a TikTok video saying when you begin a presentation, you should start with 3 fun facts about yourself. And since we all know that TikTok is always right, who am I to dispute this? So my 3 fun facts are, I'm the chair of our International Trade and National Security Practice. where we publish a bi-weekly series of what every multinational should know about various international trade topics. And these include every major holiday, a international compliance parody. So if you've ever been looking for things like an article like Peter Rabbit discovers compliance or the Grinch who stole compliance, now you know where to go. Second fun fact is my daughter will be competing in the Olympics in Paris in 2024 as a fencer. And the third fun fact is 2 years ago, I cut off my own thumb with a circular saw and had to have it sewn back on. So tell me which one of those three facts you consider to be the most interesting. Will tell me a lot about what you think about compliance. Next slide, please. So one of the themes we're going to be talking about today, and probably the main takeaway, is regulators around the world are sending a consistent message, which is multinational companies need to take responsibility for their global supply chains. Next slide, please. And what that means is think of your supply chain as being an extension of your company. It's not just a source of goods or services, rather it's like an extension of the company. And what they're saying is you need to take ownership of it. You need to understand what's going on throughout your supply chain and take responsibility for the ethical operation of it. So a lot of times people will come to us as lawyers and say, you know, we need a conflict minerals policy to help us out with our supply chain, or we want to expand our economic sanctions policy to cover more supply chain issues. And what we usually say is you need to step back. Instead of thinking about like specific legal regimes, all these different legal regimes, supply chain transparency laws, OFAC sanctions hitting suppliers, conflict minerals, forced labor and human trafficking, the new Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, all these things are sending a consistent message, which is you need to have an ethical supply chain and you need to take ownership and responsibility for it. Next slide, please. So because of that, some of the things we're going to be talking about, we are going to talk about some new developments that are happening that govern the supply chain, but always you need to step back and say, these are just examples of different ways and different angles that the regulators are trying to hit the concept of having supply chain integrity. And next slide, please. So the first new development is an interesting one, which is the DDP, the digital product passports. Now, when you first look at this, you might say, oh, does this really impact me? Because it's aimed at textiles and apparel products. But this is likely kind of the wave of the future, because what it's doing is it's setting up tools that are designed to allow various people, including regulators, to collect and share product data throughout the life cycle of the product. So it's actually broader than just supply chain, because it's going to encompass supply chain and information related to it using like a blockchain way to keep the information secure. But it allowed right up through distribution, up to the consumer, to the final disposition of the product. So by 2030, every textile product for sale in the EU is going to require a DPP, probably in the form of a scannable QR code. And this is going to allow anyone who scans it to have information about where the product came from, what it's made of, how the supply chain, which companies were part of it, sustainability, and then eventually recyclability of it. But the EU is considering expanding this for apparel, batteries, and consumer electronics. And even though the United States tends to be in the forefront of compliance, in the area of like ESG and sustainability, the EU has been taking the lead. So our expectation is as this rolls out, other governments are going to start looking at this as well. So this is something to consider and to be planning, which is by getting a handle on the ethical sourcing in your supply chain, you're also preparing for the likelihood of things like the DDP for applying to your goods. Next slide, please. Another piece of this is the EU Supply Chain Act. Next slide. The EU Supply Chain Act is following in the wake of a German law, which was mandating increasing supply chain due diligence. as well as various EU supply chain transparency acts, such as in France and Norway and other countries. And what this is it is imposing requirements for climate transition plans, but it is imposing special due diligence requirements not only on large EU companies, those with 1,000 or more employees and exceeding 450 million euros, but also non-EU companies and parent companies that have significant revenue originating in the EU, 450 million euros. There's also requirements for franchises with a turnover of more than 80 million euros, or 22.5 million generated by royalties, also to be looking into special due diligence requirements and to be putting in place climate transition plans. So again, this is extending out to the supply chain as a way of trying to, again, push this message of companies taking ownership of their supply chains and acting ethically with regard to how the supply chain operates, including in the climate area. Next slide, please. So some of the due diligence requirements are companies that are covered are going to need to conduct risk-based human rights and environmental due diligence across what they call their value chain, which encompasses the supply chain plus more. But it includes both upstream activities such as the design, extraction, and manufacture of goods and getting them to the EU market, but also downstream activities such as the distribution, transport, and storage. Again, it's about companies taking ownership not only of their supply chain, but of their products and how they'll eventually be disposed of. Some of the due diligence requirements are to integrate and have formal due diligence as part of your policies and risk management systems. It requires the identification, assessment, and prioritization of human rights and environmental impacts and taking steps to mitigate them. Establishing a notification mechanism and complaints procedure, basically so consumers or other people can come to you and complain about how your supply chain is operating or how your goods are being handled. And then monitoring the effectiveness of due diligence policies and measures. Now, by the way, these are the same type of due diligence requirements that we have long been urging companies to take on as part of their own ethical, supply chain integrity efforts themselves. And these are the kind of things you should be doing if you're putting in place like forced labor and human trafficking policies or economic sanctions. You would want to be looking at these things, including putting in place due diligence and monitoring the effectiveness of it. Next slide, please. Now, in keeping with the topic about doing business in the United States, wanted to spend in a little more detail to have a discussion about what the U.S. government is doing with regard to forced labor, human trafficking, and the UFLPA, the Uyghurs Forced Labor Prevention Act. Next slide, please. The key thing to note is this is a new emphasis, but it's not a new subject area. Customs has long had rules in the United States, Customs Border Protection, against the importation of goods made by forced labor or goods that are made by employees that are victims of human trafficking. And these include the ability to detain goods, and they use what are known as withhold release orders, which means basically they seize the goods if they have credible information of these kinds of violations, and they'll only release them once they have information to show that the goods are being ethically sourced. And once you have a withhold release order in place, then all imports from that company are going to be held up, every single one, until you show that there's no problem with the goods. But the UFLPA really changes the game on forced labor. And the biggest, the best way to show this is to look at the amount of seizures. 3 years ago, there was about $3 to $4 million a year of goods that were seized, which is very small compared to the amount of imports that are coming in. And then just a couple years later, they're now running at a pace of over $2 billion a year of goods that are being seized. And this is coming about in part because the UFLPA vastly expands what's considered to be goods made by forced labor, but also because it's set up dedicated enforcement resources at CBP. So there's now people whose sole task at CBP is not collecting tariffs or dealing with copyright issues like you normally see CBP doing, but where they're focused completely on supply chain and forced labor issues, particularly goods that are coming from China, which may run afoul of the UFLPA requirements. Next slide, please. So the UFLPA represents a presumption. So what it is if goods basically contain parts and components or were themselves manufactured in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, the XUAR, then you're going to have a presumption that these goods are the subject of forced labor, and customs is going to detain them until you show by clear and convincing evidence that the goods, in fact, did not benefit from forced labor and don't have a connection to the Uyghur Autonomous Area. So the goods that can be detained are goods wholly in part manufactured, mined, or produced in the XUAR, goods produced by entities that work with the Xinjiang regional government to recruit, transport, harbor, or receive forced labor. The export of products to the United States that are made wholly or in part from parts and components from the Xinjiang region or from companies that work with the regional government. Goods from companies that source material from there, or goods linked with companies that are on the UFLPA entity list, which is companies that have been found to be in violation. So as a result of this, if you look at there's a UFLPA dashboard. If you put in UFLPA customs dashboard, it'll come up, which shows statistics and breakdowns. You'll see that not unexpectedly, one of the main sources of detention is goods from China, but also goods coming from other parts of Southeast Asia and even Mexico are up there in the top 5 or 6 lists of countries. And it's because of the coverage of goods that contain parts and components. So it's easy to say, well, the UFLPA doesn't directly affect me because I don't import from China, but you still need to understand your supply chain if you're importing from other areas of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, but even countries like Mexico, because of the possibility that you may have parts or components that came from there that were purchased by your supplier from a sub-supplier or even purchased on the open market. Next slide, please. So under the UFLPA, if your goods are detained, roughly 50% of the goods actually are eventually released. And the way they're released is you overcome the presumption. You rebut the presumption that the goods were produced in whole or in part, basically by having some kind of link to the XUAR. And the key to this is not to be starting on your supply chain mapping and your compliance when you get the detention notice from CBP. Rather, it's to be prepared ahead of time. And basic supply chain ABCs, like mapping your supply chain, doing due diligence, understanding who your sub-suppliers are, how they do business, having in place terms and conditions.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. It looks like Greg might be having some technical issues, so let's just give him another minute. And see if he can't resolve it on his end. While we're waiting, are there any questions that the audience may have at this time? Looks like he's trying to dial back in.
Sorry about that. It's like the old joke about the dancing bear at the circus. You shouldn't critique how well the bear dances. You should just be surprised the bear can dance at all. So the fact that we can do this from multiple areas is, I guess, a wonder in itself, even if it means we occasionally freeze. Anyway, we're back. So we thought it would be helpful to map out kind of 6 steps to compliance. And again, this is going to cover both like forced labor and human trafficking, but also UFLPA compliance. And it's all, again, part of the idea of taking ownership of your supply chain. So the step 1 of the 6 steps of compliance is you need to map your supply chain. And this is probably something that you've heard before. And the key thing is it's surprising how many companies will have a good handle on their suppliers, but they won't know their sub-suppliers or the suppliers to their sub-suppliers. And given that there's the UFLPA in particular covers parts and components, you need to, as a very first step, understand thoroughly every piece of your supply chain right down to the last sub-supplier. And this is something that you need to keep up to date as an ongoing resource, and it's something where you're going to need to coordinate with your suppliers to flow down requirements about forced labor and human trafficking and the UFLPA, but also that they just need to do the basic blocking and tackling of letting you know who they are, so that you can use risk-based principles to see where you need to be doing further due diligence, things like that. Next slide, please. Step 2, conduct due diligence on key suppliers. Very few companies do due diligence on all their suppliers. So what your key tool is to use risk-based principles. Larger suppliers in China or in Southeast Asia are obviously going to be more of a priority. You're going to need to use these for extra due diligence. When you have these larger suppliers or places that are raising more of a supply chain risk, then you're going to want to understand and gather documentation about how the good was made, who worked on it, what was done by you, what was done by your suppliers, what subassembly was done, and basically the role of the entities at each step of the supply chain. I mean, you need to have this mapped out, because if you don't know where it's coming from and you haven't conducted due
It looks like Greg is frozen again. All right, well, I'm going to take a couple of the questions. Thank you. Thank you, folks, for chiming in with some questions so I can fill the dead space here while Greg tries to come back online. The first question is, how do you usually approach battle of the forms arguments associated with use of T's and C's? Much of manufacturing operates under the basis of form documents, as we know. You send a request for quotation that says it's going to be under our terms as the buyer. The supplier then sends a quotation with its own terms and conditions of sale, and then there's a purchase order issued with terms and conditions of purchase. So not everything is going to be negotiated under a master supply agreement or an LTA. You can't do it. Much of manufacturing would come to a screeching halt, and we need to get stuff moving and purchases made. So there are very frequently in manufacturing two competing sets of terms. How is it approached with respect to Battle of the Forms under the UCC? Well, I'll tell you that what you're supposed to conduct with the analysis is you're supposed to look and see, okay, across the two sets of terms, where do the terms align? Meaning, where do we have an agreement? And then those terms go into the contract. Where are the terms materially different? And almost anything that differs in any meaningful way is going to be considered materially different. And those terms are supposed to be cut out of the contract and gap filled with the UCC's gap filler provisions, which makes a Frankenstein of a contract. And no two judges or arbitrators will analyze that scenario in the same way. The UCC is incredibly buyer-friendly. It's drafted to be buyer-friendly with lots of protections for the buyer. So to the extent that the buyer is able to knock out some or all of the seller's terms, it's going to be a buyer-favorable contract. I'll let Greg get back to the regulatory.
Okay, if you can move to the next slide, please. So again, as part of your due diligence, you want to cover UFLPA concerns regarding, in most cases, people are looking for information to show that they don't have any parts and components coming from the XUAR. If you do have parts and components coming from there, you then need to go through a very, very careful due diligence process to basically show that the people who are working there are working free of coercion. Next slide, please. The third step, examining the sub-suppliers. Sub-suppliers actually tend to be more problematic than the suppliers themselves. So it's very, very important to ensure not only that you have the flow down conditions so that the sub-suppliers are receiving notification and have legal notification that they're required to comply with forced labor requirements, but that this is actually being carried through. Some companies are actually implementing unique identifiers to track raw materials and other inputs. So again, that's going back to the DDP that we were talking about, the use of technology to foster your compliance efforts. Next slide. Develop legal protections. This is a good opportunity if you don't have a vendor code of conduct to update one or to create one. Review all your contractual documents. A lot of companies have more focused on the sales side and having terms and conditions that reflect like OFAC sanctions and things like that. But again, looking at all your contractual documents to be certain that your agreements, your POs, things like that are cover forced labor and human trafficking and UFLPA coverage as well. If you haven't looked
Sorry about that. Hopefully we'll be able to circulate the slides to the attendees so that you can read through Greg's content. As I was saying with respect to the Battle of the Forms, there's no way to prevent Battle of the Forms arguments for the most part unless you do enter into the excruciating process of negotiating and getting a signed agreement between the parties on every term. Most companies will say, look, let's just each have our own forms and we'll live to fight another day about what we agreed to and what we didn't agree to. There's some case law out there, depending on the jurisdiction, that talks about, well, if the purchase order is the last word, where you have signed up to the buyer's terms and conditions by shipping under the purchase order. But I think that requires a very detailed and nuanced analysis, looking all the way back through all the commercial documents to see what each party said at the time of contracting. Okay. The next question that I have is, from a labor perspective, how can unions affect or help to avoid the labor obstacles that I talked about earlier with respect to the fertility rate around the world and the reducing populations? I think labor unions are always going to have a critical role to play in U.S. manufacturing. I think that it's a double-edged sword. They're also going to cause strikes and stalls, and manufacturing lines will go down to the extent that the union needs to use its leverage to get the protections that the union members want or feel that they deserve to continue on. But there are additional benefits, incentives, and protections from a unionized labor force that are in play and that can help keep our US-based operations healthy. Go ahead, Greg.
Okay, it's like a tag team, like a sitcom. Number 4, in case we're cut out, really, update a creative vendor code of conduct, review all your contractual documents, your POs, and update your general terms and conditions to be certain that you not only are covering forced labor and human trafficking and supply chain issues in the UFLPA, but also that you are requiring your suppliers to flow down those conditions to their suppliers and to the sub-suppliers. And next slide, please. 5, you really, really need to communicate and train across the supply chain. And we saw this first when conflict minerals came up. People would send out these surveys as to like how, do you use conflict minerals? And you were lucky if you got 55% of people to respond. I mean, it requires not only communicating and training across the supply chain, but constantly following up. Are they actually giving you the due diligence? Are they taking it seriously and filling it out? And that's really, really important, is to make sure that you are training and communicating across the supply chain. That includes also providing training to your own employees so that they understand, people who deal with their suppliers in particular, that it's important to do a forced labor and UFLPA risk assessment, identify the risks of forced labor, make sure they understand the problems that can come if your goods are detained by customs, and in particular when you're importing goods where there's a higher likelihood that the goods came from China because they may have parts and components that are from the Uyghur Autonomous Region. Next slide, please. Finally, step 6 is you need to monitor compliance. This isn't a one and done kind of thing. It's something where you need to be constantly thinking about following up on your due diligence, being alert for red flags, following up on the red flags, and figuring out what's going on with your suppliers. I mean, if there's a problem, you have to decide, are we going to continue to deal with this supplier, or do we think they can be rehabilitated? Were they just making a mistake and it was a one-off? Or is this something that we can fix with better training or better communication? Or does it really indicate a lax attitude towards compliance? So it's very, very important to develop a corrective action plan, because you need to think about this from the standpoint of the regulator. If the regulator saw how you handled it, would they be satisfied that you were taking it seriously? And again, if you are thinking about this, you should be using risk-based principles, which also can include the idea of independent third-party verification, which we're seeing more and more, that companies are bringing in these outside auditors to help them with the compliance and to establish a auditable trail as to how they're handling things. Next slide. Finally, when you circulate the slides, as Vanessa said, will be coming around, here are some resources that the US government has put together. These are all hyperlinks. You can pull them up. They're for companies who are looking to up their compliance game. These are good resources. We also had a 3-part series in our biweekly emails on coping with the UFLPA. If you just search for my name and what every multinational should know about the UFLPA, you'll see the 3-part series, which covers, explains the UFLPA, explains compliance, and then explains what are the best practices for dealing with detentions. So we highly recommend those as well. So I see we are right at the 1 minute over. So I'm happy to stay on if there's any questions, as long as they don't involve my facility with Wi-Fi.
There is one question that maybe Elizabeth, can you just let us know, is there any more CLE codes that are required, or are we all done because it was just the hour?
That is it for the CLE codes. While I'm on, I will repeat it again. It was V as in Victor, T as in Tom, 3, H as in Henry, and N. Again, V, T, 3, H, 9, VT, 3H9. I will additionally follow up with all the attendees after the session with the recording of the session, the slides, and any additional CLE information. Thank you.
So looks like there's a 3 in the upper left-hand corner. Is that there's 3 questions or 3 people giving a thumbs down to my Wi-Fi
I think,
skills?
Greg, yeah, I think that there is one question for you that remains. What is the best approach to identify if our suppliers and sub-suppliers are complying with all the discussed regulations?
It's not one thing. I mean, the first thing is to communicate the requirements to them and make sure that they understand that. The second part is to consider how big and how important they are. If they're a smaller company, a lot of times people will rely on terms and conditions and flag this for them, and require certifications. But when it's larger, that's when people will cover more due diligence forms, requiring them to complete questionnaires. They may consider sending out having to do a small audit of them, with regard to that. That usually comes up for companies this is done more in like the Southeast Asian region or in China. It requires, you're dealing with another company. So sometimes they're reluctant to share this information because it, requires you to do things like check how they're handling, foreign labor. You have these situations where some companies will bring people in and then they'll take their passports so that they can't leave, and then they won't pay them what they promised them and things like that. It's a combination of assessing the risk, conducting the due diligence, following up on the due diligence, which can be expensive. So it's usually reserved for the bigger companies in the higher risk regions. So that's the continuum. Kind of the least is doing like terms and conditions, and then the most is doing an audit, and in between is like the due diligence questionnaires, and where you fall in that depends on your application of the the risk that you see for that supplier.
Excellent. Well, if there's any more questions, just feel free to type them in. If not, you know where to find us. Our emails are on the attached, and we appreciate everyone's time and attention for this program today.
Okay, happy to answer any follow-up questions people might have.